The Trump administration is sparking backlash for its policies impacting the transgender community. On Thursday, the Justice Department filed a brief to the Supreme Court arguing federal law does not protect transgender workers from certain types of discrimination. A CBSN Originals documentary released last year explored the definitions and vocabulary in the transgender community. Christina Capatides produced that documentary titled Gender, the Space Between, and she joins us now to discuss the latest news on this topic. Christina, so great to have you here. Yesterday, the Department of Justice issued some news regarding transgender people that has the entire LGBTQ community concerned. Can you tell us about that?
Right. Yesterday, the Department of Justice sent a memo to the Supreme Court basically stating that Title VII, which is a civil rights law protecting against discrimination on the basis of sex, does not extend to transgender workers.
And this came up in an actual case, correct? Someone was fired who came out as transgender?
Right. The filing comes as the Supreme Court is weighing whether or not to consider the case of a Detroit funeral home which fired a worker for after she came out as transgender. And a lower court already decided that that was discrimination on the basis of sex. They said that inherently, firing an employee on the basis of being transgender necessarily is firing an employee on the basis of sex. But the Detroit funeral home has appealed that, and now it may go to the Supreme Court, and the Department of Justice is complicating matters.
And so the Supreme Court may ultimately have to decide what is gender exactly, correct?
Right.
This is so interesting. So you traveled the country speaking with young people who, do not identify necessarily with either gender, or some who identify with both. Can you explain exactly how that works to a lot of people who are still confused, and what these young people told you?
Right. So gender non-binary, how I always describe it to people is most of us think that being transgender is either going from male to female or going from female to male. But that male and female are actually ends of a binary spectrum. And while many transgender people do go from one end of that spectrum to the other, there's still many more that identify as non-binary, which is somewhere in the space between. So they can either fluctuate with masculinity and femininity on a daily basis, or they can exist off of the spectrum altogether. Some people are agender. It's just much more nuanced than what many people consider transgender. And a study of 81,000 teens in Minnesota, which came out in February, found that of 81,000 high school age students in grades 9 and 11, nearly 3% of them identified as either being transgender or gender nonconforming, which is sort of a staggering number. It's nearly it's more than 2,000 out of 81,000.
That is a staggering number, and that number continues to go up, correct? And tell us the reasons for that. The reasons are not because, suddenly it's okay. The reasons are because these young people have always felt this way, and now they have the language to describe it.
Exactly.
Correct?
Experts think that but as trans awareness spreads throughout the country, it is empowering transgender teens to come out and experiment with their gender identity, but it's also making the terms, non-binary terms, more accessible, and that's something that we discuss in our doc. It's often a pivotal moment in the coming out process when you learn a term that maybe you hadn't known existed that matches what you are on the inside. We talked to an agender graduate student at NYU named Bryn, who describes first coming out as a trans woman and feeling like, well, this isn't right, and then coming out as a gay man, and then feeling like this isn't right. And it was just that those were the two terms that they knew, and when they then learned agender was a term, was an option, they thought, oh, this is what I've been all along, I just didn't know how to describe that.
And what is that feeling like for people like that person who had just been searching for the description that they knew they needed to inhabit? When they finally find it, what is it like for them? I
mean, many of the people that we spoke to just described it as everything finally falling into place. It's very freeing. It's a joyous moment, really. And I also want to add that in that Minnesota study, one of the other things that's really interesting is outside of the 3% that identified as either transgender or gender nonconforming, still more responded to the study that they believe that boy and girl are not the only options.
Very, very interesting. Now, those numbers that you quoted earlier that show such an increase, what else do they tell us about what we can expect in the future?
I think that it's a safe assumption that those numbers will continue to go up. Many experts believe that, as people are more empowered to come out, they will, but also the culture is changing a bit. But what's interesting, though, is that the study also revealed that the teens that responded that they identify as being either transgender or gender nonconforming also responded to the survey that they had worse mental and physical health than their cisgender peers. So cisgender means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth.
Well, sure, that makes sense because society is sort of, built around cisgender
There's a lot of bullying,
norms, right?
There's discrimination, societal pressures.
And so how should pediatricians, schools, parents adapt?
So pediatricians, experts recommend that they make an effort to make trans teens feel comfortable seeking out health care, and that's often as simple as using, gender-neutral pronouns and asking teens how they identify at the start of a session. One of the characters that we spoke to in the doc, Bryn, who I mentioned before, said that I asked Bryn, in your perfect world, what would make you feel comfortable? How do you want people to be towards you? And Bryn said, I don't need you to know the gender theory. What I need you to do is use these words and don't use these words. Right. It's really as simple. It's really as simple as that. And yes. It's funny. I heard an anecdote just yesterday from a music teacher in Virginia, who described they were involved in a district-wide vocal audition. And before this year's audition, there was an announcement that there would be new gender rules. And they said that amongst the teachers, there was a lot of hand-wringing and anxiety of, oh, what if this changes the way we do things? But when the announcement came, all it was this year people will be allowed to audition for whichever part their voice fits. And instead of calling them boys' parts and girls' parts, historically alto and bass and tenor are boys' parts and soprano and alto are girls' parts. They would just be referred to as high voices and low voices. And the teacher said everybody, after they heard the announcement, just said, oh, okay, we can do that. It's just simple.
Right. It's very simple when you break it down like that. Now, of course, you've spoken to these young people a while ago now, before this news has come out. It seemed as if acceptance was moving forward apace. Now it seems as if that might be rolled back a bit. How can you imagine this community is reacting?
I think it's devastating. You're seeing a lot of reporting now and people saying that the Trump administration could potentially define transgender out of existence. I think that the Supreme Court will probably have to weigh in and decide which definition of sex is the one going forward. I mean, the Obama Department of Justice took a broader definition of sex as being gender identity, and the Trump Department of Justice is coming out differently. They're saying it's binary and biological. It's what's on your birth certificate. So those two are very different things, and we're going to have to figure out if it's nuanced or if it's not in America, and it's really sort of life or death for these people.
It certainly is. Christina Capatides, thank you so much for coming to see us today. And a quick reminder, you can watch the CBSN Originals documentary Gender, the Space Between anytime on your streaming devices, the CBS News app, or at cbsnews.com.